So the guy busted for stealing menthol cigarettes and beef jerky could be the next Maya Angelou.
At its peak, Night Court ruled late-night TV. Then, almost without warning, it vanished. Behind the scenes, whispers of creative implosions, cast tensions, tragic losses, and a network growing restless spread through the industry. When the show eventually ended, it was for a reason no one saw coming. Even its 2023 revival couldn't escape the same fate. So what really unraveled television's most eccentric courtroom? The rise of Night Court. When Night Court hit television in 1984, it landed with a kind of eccentric charm that no one quite saw coming. Audiences quickly found themselves hooked on its oddball mix of courtroom chaos, heartfelt moments, and pure absurdity. It was funny, unpredictable, and somehow cozy all at once. The show took something as serious as a Manhattan courtroom and turned it into a nightly parade of wild characters and unpredictable cases, and people couldn't get enough of it. But as much as viewers fell in love with the laughter, the wit, and the heart of the show, the world that created Night Court was far more complicated than it looked on screen. The man behind it all was Reinhold Weege, a writer and producer who had already made his mark on another beloved sitcom, Barney Miller, a clever, character-driven comedy set in a New York police precinct. Weege carried that same sensibility into Night Court, but he wanted to go even further this time. His inspiration came from the real world, specifically the strange world of late-night arraignment courts in Manhattan. These courts actually existed, handling cases deep into the night, where the city's most bizarre and unpredictable moments played out under fluorescent lights. Weege saw an opportunity to build a show that reflected that energy, a place where you could find comedy and chaos, humanity and absurdity, and just enough heart to keep it all grounded. The centerpiece of the show was Judge Harold Stone, played by Harry Anderson. He was quirky, magic-loving, and carried an optimism that stood out in the gritty world of late-night New York. Anderson himself wasn't a typical sitcom actor. He was a magician and stand-up performer, and that offbeat energy defined the show's tone. Then there was prosecutor Dan Fielding, played by John Larroquette, who became the show's breakout character almost overnight. Sleazy, self-absorbed, and shamelessly ambitious, Dan was the kind of character you couldn't help but watch. Larroquette played him with such perfect timing that even his most outrageous moments felt believable. His performance didn't just steal scenes, it defined the show's comedic edge and earned him 4 consecutive Emmy Awards. And of course, Night Court wouldn't have been the same without Richard Mall as Bull Shannon, the towering, lovable bailiff with a childlike innocence that somehow balanced out the courtroom's chaos. Bull became one of those instantly recognizable TV characters, the kind audiences rooted for because he seemed to mean every word he said, even when it was ridiculous. Over the years, the cast saw plenty of changes, especially in the role of the public defender. The early seasons featured a rotating door of talented women, Karen Austin, Paula Kelly, and Ellen Foley, who all brought something unique to the part. But it wasn't until Markie Post joined in Season 3 as Christine Sullivan that the role truly clicked. Her chemistry with Harry Anderson gave the show a warmth and emotional thread that made viewers care about more than just the punchlines. In its first season, Night Court actually struggled to find its footing, bouncing around time slots and fighting for attention in NBC's crowded lineup. But by the second season, word of mouth started to build. Audiences discovered this strange little show with its eccentric judge and bizarre defendants, and soon it was holding its own among the network's biggest comedies. Over its 9-season run, it racked up 8 Primetime Emmy Awards and a total of 34 nominations. Beyond the awards, though, what made Night Court stand out was its distinct flavor that no other sitcom could quite replicate. When the final gavel came down in 1992 after 193 episodes, the show left behind a cult following that only grew stronger with time. Syndication kept it alive for years, and when streaming services arrived decades later, a new generation discovered it all over again. But while the show seemed almost perfect on screen, the journey behind it was filled with battles, creative clashes, casting changes, and moments of real tension that almost derailed it more than once. Behind-the-scenes challenges. As Night Court grew into one of the most recognizable sitcoms of the 1980s, most viewers didn't realize just how turbulent things were behind the camera. For all its success, the show constantly fought through creative uncertainty, shifting leadership, and a revolving door of cast and crew trying to keep the balance between comedy and chaos. In the early seasons, it was Reinhold Weege who anchored everything. His vision had given Night Court its peculiar spark that made it stand out from every other sitcom at the time. But that same creative freedom that made the show thrive also made it hard to manage. The writing staff often pushed the boundaries of what a courtroom comedy could be, introducing storylines that ranged from the bizarre to the supernatural. It was all part of the show's charm, but keeping that mix steady proved to be a constant challenge. Weege's departure after season 6 marked a turning point. Without his steady direction, Night Court began to feel like a ship without its captain. The tone shifted as different showrunners came and went, each trying to find their own version of what made the series special. Gary Murphy, Larry Strother, Chris Kloos, and Stu Kreisman all took their turns steering the production, each with slightly different ideas about where the show should go. The changes weren't dramatic enough to alienate viewers overnight, but longtime fans could sense something was off. The humor felt less spontaneous, the surreal edge less daring, and the emotional moments sometimes forced. But even before Weege's exit, continuity had already been a struggle. The frequent cast changes during the first few seasons made it difficult for the audience to settle into a rhythm. Every time viewers got used to a character, someone new appeared behind the defense table or the clerk's desk. These changes often came down to creative differences or the show's demanding production schedule. Building chemistry under those conditions wasn't easy, yet somehow, the cast kept the show moving forward with enough consistency to keep audiences invested. Behind the jokes and quick exchanges, the writer's room was a constant battleground of ideas. Balancing the show's eccentric humor with the realities of courtroom life wasn't straightforward. One day, the team might be writing a story about a typical arraignment. The next, they'd be debating whether a ghost or an alien could show up in the courtroom without completely breaking the show's logic. Reinhold Weege had encouraged writers to take risks, but not everyone agreed on how far those risks should go. The arguments weren't just creative, they were logistical. Television moved quickly in the 1980s, and Night Court was no exception. Scripts had to be turned around at a relentless pace, and rewrites were often happening hours before taping. That kind of pressure could bring out brilliance one week and exhaustion the next. The show's writers were known for working late into the night, reworking punchlines and fine-tuning jokes to keep up with the fast pace that NBC demanded. From a production standpoint, the show's setup was both an advantage and a limitation. It was filmed using a multi-camera format on videotape, which gave it the familiar energy of a live sitcom, but also came with its own headaches. The entire courtroom set, which viewers saw week after week, was reused and redressed countless times to stretch the budget. If you look closely across episodes, some of the new locations are actually the same set rearranged and repainted. It was a clever cost-saving trick, but it also showed how resourceful the crew had to be just to keep the show looking fresh. NBC wasn't always easy to please either. The network recognized that Night Court was different, but they also worried that it might be too different. Executives occasionally pushed Weege and the later showrunners to rein in the weirder ideas and aim for broader appeal. As the show's ratings grew, NBC wanted it to fit more comfortably alongside its other hits. That kind of pressure didn't sit well with everyone. Some of the cast reportedly grew frustrated when their characters began to change in ways that didn't feel true to what they'd built. John Larroquette's Dan Fielding, for example, started as a shameless womanizer with a selfish streak that defined much of the early comedy. But as the years went on, the network began to nudge the writers to soften him and make him more sympathetic and more likable. Larroquette, ever the perfectionist, wasn't entirely comfortable with the shift. He understood that audiences had to evolve with the show, but he also believed that Dan's outrageous flaws were what made him funny. As creative decisions piled up, burnout began to creep in. After years of high-intensity production, some cast and crew members simply ran out of steam. The constant effort to deliver fresh material, the long hours, and the unending tension between artistic vision and network demands took their toll. By the time the later seasons rolled around, Night Court had weathered nearly a decade of constant reinvention, and keeping that same spark alive became increasingly difficult. But not everyone came through that pressure unscathed, and while the series remained a hit on paper, several of its stars were struggling in ways the audience never saw. Some faced personal challenges that mirrored the chaos of the show itself, while others grew increasingly disillusioned as the set they loved began to change around them. Cast members' struggles. The show may have built its charm on humor and eccentricity, but for many of its stars, real life wasn't nearly as lighthearted. Some found themselves wrestling with the downsides of fame, others with illness, loss, or the quiet search for peace away from Hollywood's bright lights. At the center of it all was Harry Anderson, whose portrayal of Judge Harold T. Stone had made him one of television's most likable figures. But once the show ended, Anderson found himself caught in a problem that haunts many TV icons: typecasting. He'd created such a specific and memorable role that audiences couldn't see him as anyone else. Offers came in, but most wanted some variation of the same quirky judge. Rather than chase roles that didn't excite him, Anderson slowly stepped back from Hollywood. He returned to his first love, magic and live performance, and eventually moved to New Orleans, a city that matched his offbeat personality perfectly. There he opened a small magic shop, performed for intimate audiences, and lived life on his own terms. While he didn't disappear completely, the spotlight that had once seemed so bright no longer appealed to him. When Anderson passed away in 2018 at the age of 65 from natural causes, fans mourned more than a beloved TV character. They remembered a man who'd chosen authenticity over fame, someone who had given television one of its most distinct and kind-hearted figures. Marky Post, who joined Night Court in its third season as public defender Christine Sullivan, also faced her own long and painful battle years after the show ended. Behind her bright smile and effortless comedic timing was an incredible strength that carried her through some of her hardest moments. Post was diagnosed with cancer, a fight that lasted nearly 4 years. Despite her illness, she continued appearing in shows like Scrubs and Chicago PD, bringing the same professionalism and humor that had defined her career. She rarely spoke publicly about her condition, choosing instead to keep working and stay optimistic. Sadly, she passed away in 2021 at age 70 and is remembered as a woman of grace and resilience who never lost her spark. Richard Mall, the towering actor who brought Bull Shannon to life, faced a different kind of struggle. His height of 6 feet 8 inches and deep, resonant voice had made him perfect for the role of the gentle giant bailiff. But after the show ended, those same traits made it hard for him to find roles that weren't just variations of Bull. Casting directors often saw him as too distinctive and too recognizable. Mall continued to work steadily, appearing in films and lending his voice to animation, including several Batman projects where he voiced the villain Two-Face. Yet the shadow of Bull Shannon followed him for much of his career. Despite that, Mall remained grateful for the part that made him famous. When he passed away in October 2023 at the age of 80, tributes poured in from fans and colleagues who remembered him not only as a lovable TV character, but as a kind, down-to-earth man who never took his success for granted. Charles Robinson, who played the ever-patient court clerk Mac Robinson, also continued acting long after Night Court wrapped. He moved seamlessly between television, film, and theater, becoming one of those steady, quietly respected performers that everyone in the business admired. Sadly, Robinson's life was cut short in 2021 after complications from cardiac arrest and cancer. His death marked another loss for fans of the series, a reminder of how much of that original cast had left an indelible mark on comedy television. But the losses began much earlier. During Night Court's original run, tragedy struck twice in rapid succession. Selma Diamond, who played the sharp-tongued bailiff Selma Hacker, died of lung cancer in 1985 after the show's second season. Her dry wit and raspy voice had become a fan favorite, and her passing hit both the cast and audience hard. Her replacement, Florence Hallop, brought her own brand of humor to the show, but faced the same cruel fate, passing away from lung cancer just 1 year later. The writers had to rework scripts, rebuild character dynamics, and somehow keep the comedy alive while grieving two beloved colleagues. It was one of the toughest periods in the show's production, a painful reminder that the laughter behind the scenes was often mixed with real sorrow. John LaRoquette, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of battle. His portrayal of prosecutor Dan Fielding had made him a television icon, but off-screen, LaRoquette was struggling with alcoholism. He later admitted that during the early years of Night Court, he was drinking heavily, something he described as both a personal escape and a dangerous cycle. In 1982, before the show fully took off, he made the decision to get sober, a turning point that likely saved both his health and his career. He's spoken openly about his recovery, often crediting it with giving him the focus to channel his energy into his work. That clarity paid off. LaRoquette went on to win 4 consecutive Emmys for his performance and later built a rich career in theater and television. Marsha Warfield, who joined the show as bailiff Roz Russell after Florence Hallop's death, brought a sharp, cool energy that helped stabilize the cast. But her journey was also marked by long periods of introspection. After Night Court, Warfield stepped away from the spotlight for years, taking time to focus on herself. In 2017, she came out publicly as queer, sharing that she had spent decades keeping her private life separate from her career. The decision to speak openly, she said, wasn't just about identity. It was about freedom. In recent years, she's returned to stand-up and television, finding joy again in the work she once put aside. Then there was Karen Austin, the show's original court clerk, who left after the first season due to health problems. She had been diagnosed with Bell's palsy, a condition that temporarily paralyzes facial muscles and made it difficult for her to perform. Though her time on Night Court was short, she remained grateful for the experience and later spoke warmly about the friendships she made during that period. But while Night Court had survived these personal struggles, it wasn't immune to criticism. As the years went on, the show found itself caught in debates over tone, representation, and what some called its decline in quality. Criticism and the reboot. Night Court was never entirely free from criticism. For every viewer who adored its eccentric humor and heartfelt moments, there were others who felt that the show occasionally strayed too far from reality. From the beginning, Night Court walked a fine line between satire and silliness. Reinhold Weege's original vision had been to highlight the absurd side of late-night arraignments in New York City, a place where you could see anything from petty crimes to complete nonsense pass through in a single night. But over time, as the show leaned deeper into surreal comedy, some critics began to argue that it had gone too far. Legal professionals in particular took issue with how the show depicted the justice system, claiming it trivialized courtroom procedures and reduced them to punchlines. Articles and reviews from the mid-1980s often praised the show's creativity, but questioned its portrayal of legal work. Judges and lawyers occasionally commented that while they understood the comedic intent, they worried that casual viewers might assume real courts were just as chaotic and unprofessional. To the creative team, this was missing the point, because the show was never meant to be realistic. It was, at its core, a comedy about humanity, not law. Still, the criticism stuck, and Night Court earned a reputation for being one of the most bizarre legal comedies on television. Beyond tone, another issue that followed the show throughout its run was its revolving door of female cast members in the early years. Before Markie Post joined in Season 3, the role of public defender seemed cursed. Karen Austin, Paula Kelly, and Ellen Foley each stepped into the position, only to leave after short stints. Fans began to speculate that something was going on behind the scenes and that perhaps there was tension among the cast or friction with producers. In truth, the reasons varied. Austin's departure was linked to health issues, while Kelly and Foley reportedly left for a mix of creative and contractual reasons. Still, the constant turnover made it difficult for the show to establish stability early on. The media noticed. Entertainment columns often wondered why Night Court couldn't keep its female leads, and those rumors of backstage unease became part of the show's early reputation. When Markie Post finally joined, her charm and easy chemistry with Harry Anderson steadied the ship. She quickly became a fan favorite, and the cast dynamic solidified. But that shaky start lingered as one of the series' most talked about behind-the-scenes mysteries. There was also the question of content. While Night Court was loved for its unpredictability, it was also known for pushing the envelope with risque humor, mostly through John Larroquette's character Dan Fielding. Dan was the show's unapologetic womanizer, a man who flirted shamelessly, made suggestive jokes, and seemed to have no moral filter. In the 1980s, that brand of humor was edgy but popular, and Larroquette's delivery made it hard not to laugh. But as the years went on, some critics began to question whether the show was leaning too heavily on suggestive remarks. Dan's outrageous behavior, which had started as part of the character's charm, sometimes crossed into discomfort for more conservative audiences. Feminist critics occasionally called out the show for portraying women through the lens of Dan's lust, rather than as fully developed characters. Even fans who adored the show admitted that some of the jokes hadn't aged well. It wasn't malicious by all accounts. Night Court was progressive in many ways, but its sense of humor was very much a product of its time. Looking back, what once seemed bold and funny could feel out of step with modern sensibilities. Yet, interestingly, that unapologetic tone was also part of why people loved it. The show was never afraid to be a little wild, a little inappropriate, and completely unpredictable. When the Night Court reboot arrived in 2023, it brought all of those comparisons back into the spotlight. Longtime fans were hopeful but cautious. The revival starred Melissa Rauch as Abby Stone, the daughter of Harry Anderson's character, taking her place as the new judge in the same late-night courtroom. On paper, it was a perfect way to honor the original while creating something new. Rauch also served as executive producer, aiming to blend nostalgia with a modern sensibility. But the reaction was mixed. Some viewers appreciated the effort to capture the heart of the original, especially its optimism, weirdness, and focus on compassion. However, others felt that it missed the spark that had made the 80s version so special. Critics pointed out that the new Night Court played things safer, smoothing out the rough edges that had given the original its identity. But the biggest point of debate came down to tone. Fans argued that the reboot was trying too hard to be warm and heartfelt, losing the offbeat rhythm that had defined the original. Melissa Rauch's performance was widely praised for sincerity, but not everyone connected with her portrayal of Abby. Some missed the eccentric energy of Harry Anderson's Judge Stone, while others felt that the writing simply didn't give the new characters enough depth to stand on their own. Social media made those opinions louder. Forums and comment sections were filled with nostalgic fans comparing every joke, every setup, and every set design to the old days. A few called it a respectful tribute, others dismissed it as a pale imitation. The series did manage to introduce Night Court to a new generation, but it also reminded older viewers of what had been lost. But even the most resilient shows eventually hit their limit, and Night Court came to an end in a way that no one expected. Why the show ended. After nearly a decade on the air, Night Court began to feel like a relic of an earlier, weirder time in sitcom history. Ratings began to slide, not disastrously, but noticeably, especially during seasons 8 and 9. Network tastes were shifting fast. NBC was pouring attention into newer, sleeker hits like Seinfeld and Friends, series that reflected a different kind of urban comedy. Night Court, with its neon-lit set and zany tone, suddenly seemed a little too 80s for the 90s. Behind the scenes, the cost of production was also rising. The cast's salaries had grown, and the elaborate multi-camera setup that once gave the show its lively energy was now becoming expensive to maintain. NBC executives were juggling new programming priorities, including live sports coverage, particularly NBA games, which often pushed regular sitcom slots around the schedule. For a series built on routine and loyal weekly viewers, that kind of inconsistency was a silent ratings killer. After season 8, NBC wanted another renewal, believing the show could still hold its slot, but the production team and cast had a different feeling. Many of them were exhausted, and storylines were running thin. In fact, the cast and crew had begun preparing for a proper finale. There was supposed to be closure, a true send-off for Judge Harry Stone and his court of misfits. But when NBC's schedule abruptly changed, the planned final episode had to be rewritten, and a new season was written at the last minute. undoing all the closures and storylines the creative team had struggled to establish. Night Court eventually ended with a one-hour finale, which aired on May 13, 1992. However, the show ended without a clear conclusion, leaving more questions than answers for the audience. Fans were left divided. Some felt the ending reflected the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the show. However, others saw it as a missed opportunity to give these beloved characters a proper goodbye. Whatever the sentiment, Night Court's end marked the close of an era for NBC's eccentric comedies, the kind that could mix slapstick with sentiment in a single breath. The show's 2023 reboot also suffered a similar fate when viewership slipped both on traditional TV and on streaming platforms. NBC executive Jeff Bader would later explain that despite the show's warm reception, it simply didn't see growth on either front, not on linear broadcast or on digital platforms. But it wasn't just Night Court struggling. Across the industry, reboots were starting to lose steam. The mid-2020s were filled with revival fatigue, where beloved titles returned, only to fade quickly after a season or two. When NBC announced the show's cancellation after its third season in 2025, it didn't come as a shock, more like a quiet acknowledgement that the TV landscape had changed. Attempts to shop the reboot to other networks and streaming services fell through. Even nostalgia couldn't keep it afloat. The revival had heart, but the market was overcrowded, and audiences were fragmented across dozens of platforms. In a way, both the 1992 and 2025 endings mirrored each other. Neither came with fanfare or closure. Both were quiet fade-outs for a show that had once thrived on noise, laughter, and late-night energy. Yet the legacy of Night Court endures. It's remembered not just for its humor, but for its heart, for being weird, and for being human. Which Night Court did it better, the original or the reboot? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.